October 10th, 1944. A quiet road outside Herrlingen, Germany. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel climbed into a staff car alongside two SS generals he had never met before. His wife Lucy watched from the doorway of their home, her face frozen in a moment of terrible understanding. His son Manfred, just 16 years old, stood beside her. Rommel had told them both the same thing minutes earlier. "In 15 minutes, I will be dead." The car drove less than a mile before it stopped. The two SS generals stepped out and walked a short distance away, turning their backs with practiced precision. Inside the vehicle, Rommel swallowed the contents of a small glass vial. The cyanide worked quickly. When the generals returned, Germany's most celebrated field commander was already dying. They would report his death as a heart attack. They would give him a state funeral. They would praise his loyalty to the Führer. Every word would be a lie. This is the story of how Germany's greatest general became Adolf Hitler's most dangerous enemy. It's a story that begins not with betrayal, but with genuine admiration. A story of slow disillusionment, of horrifying discoveries, and of a choice that would cost Rommel everything. The real reason Rommel turned against Hitler wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was something far more complex, far more human, and far more devastating than most people realize. To understand what happened in that car outside Herrlingen, we have to go back to 1933. Erwin Rommel was 42 years old, a decorated veteran of the First World War, and a career military officer in a Germany that was finding its feet again after years of humiliation. The Treaty of Versailles had gutted the German military, reduced it to a shadow of its former self. Officers like Rommel had stayed on through lean years, teaching at military schools, training a skeleton force, and wondering if Germany would ever be anything more than Europe's defeated pariah. Then Adolf Hitler came to power. To Rommel, Hitler represented something that resonated deeply. Here was a man who had also fought in the trenches of the Great War, who understood the soldier's sacrifice, who spoke about restoring German pride and rebuilding German strength. Rommel wasn't a Nazi party member. He never joined. But he was a German patriot, and Hitler's vision of a resurgent Germany aligned with everything Rommel believed his country deserved. In 1935, Hitler began to openly defy the Treaty of Versailles, rebuilding the military that the treaty had tried to destroy. For officers like Rommel, it felt like vindication. Germany was standing up again. Rommel's first direct interaction with Hitler came in 1935, when he was assigned to be part of the military escort for the Führer at the annual Nuremberg rally. It was here that Rommel first experienced Hitler's charisma, that strange magnetic quality that so many people described, but found impossible to explain. Hitler had a way of making you believe. He spoke with absolute certainty, absolute conviction. When he talked about Germany's future, he made it sound inevitable, glorious. Right? Rommel, like millions of others, was impressed. Over the next few years, their paths would cross occasionally. Hitler recognized in Rommel a kindred spirit, a man who had proven himself in combat, who understood warfare at a visceral level, who led from the front. When war came in 1939, Hitler gave Rommel command of his personal security battalion during the invasion of Poland. It was a position of trust, a sign of favor. Then came France in 1940, and everything changed. Hitler gave Rommel command of the 7th Panzer Division, and Rommel proved himself to be a tactical genius. He moved faster than anyone thought possible, pushing his tanks and men beyond what doctrine said they could do, always leading from the front, always taking risks that paid off. His division earned the nickname the Ghost Division because it moved so fast that even German high command often didn't know where it was. Rommel drove his panzers all the way to the English Channel, cutting off Allied forces, helping to ensure Germany's stunning victory. Hitler was ecstatic. He had found his perfect general, a man who embodied the aggressive, audacious spirit that Blitzkrieg demanded. Rommel was promoted, decorated, and praised in the press. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, turned Rommel into a household name, the face of German military excellence. In February of 1941, Hitler sent Rommel to North Africa to shore up the failing Italian forces fighting the British. Rommel was given command of what would become the Africa Corps, and he was given a relatively simple objective: hold the line, prevent a complete collapse. Rommel, being Rommel, did more than that. Within weeks of arriving, he launched an offensive that drove the British back hundreds of miles. He captured key ports, won battles against superior numbers, and earned himself a new nickname from his enemies. The British started calling him the Desert Fox, a term of grudging respect for an opponent who seemed to always be one step ahead, who fought with cunning and daring in equal measure. Back in Germany, Rommel's star rose even higher. Hitler promoted him to field marshal, and the propaganda machine went into overdrive. Rommel was everything Germany wanted to see in its military: brave, brilliant, victorious. The relationship between Rommel and Hitler during these early years was genuinely warm. Rommel wrote letters home to his wife, Lucy, describing his meetings with the Führer in positive terms. Hitler, for his part, gave Rommel freedom that other generals didn't enjoy. Rommel could ignore orders from the German High Command if he disagreed with them, and he did, frequently. He would receive operational directives, tear them up, and do things his own way. This drove the staff officers in Berlin crazy, but Hitler let it happen because Rommel kept winning. The British, meanwhile, were baffled. They had cracked the German Enigma code and were reading German military communications in real time. They would see orders telling Rommel to do one thing and then watch him do something completely different. It made him nearly impossible to predict, and it made him nearly impossible to stop. But there were cracks starting to form, hairline fractures in the relationship that would eventually shatter it completely. The first crack appeared in late 1942. Rommel's early successes in North Africa had been built on momentum, on speed, on catching the British off balance. By late 1942, the situation had changed dramatically. The United States had entered the war and was pouring resources into North Africa. British forces were receiving massive reinforcements. Meanwhile, Rommel's supply lines stretched across the Mediterranean, and British and American forces were systematically destroying the ships, trying to keep him supplied. Rommel began sending increasingly desperate messages back to Germany. He needed tanks, fuel, ammunition, food, everything. The responses he got were either silence or promises that never materialized. Hitler had already moved on, mentally. His attention was focused on the Eastern Front, on the invasion of the Soviet Union that he had launched in June of 1941. To Hitler, North Africa was a sideshow, a minor theater that didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Rommel, fighting in that supposedly minor theater, watched his men suffer and die from lack of supplies, while Germany's industrial capacity flowed east. In October of 1942, the British launched their offensive at El Alamein. Rommel, sick with dysentery and jaundice, fought a brilliant defensive battle, but he was hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. His tanks ran out of fuel in the middle of combat. His artillery ran out of shells. His men fought until they couldn't fight anymore, and then they retreated. It was the beginning of the end in North Africa. Rommel returned to Germany in March of 1943 to personally confront Hitler about the North Africa situation. It was their first truly hostile meeting. Rommel told Hitler bluntly that North Africa was lost. that they needed to evacuate immediately before the entire Afrika Korps was captured or killed. Hitler's response was to criticize Rommel for not knowing basic facts about his own army. "How many rifles do you have?" Hitler demanded. Rommel, who was a field commander, not a supply clerk, admitted he didn't have the exact count. Hitler used this to humiliate him. What kind of general doesn't know how many rifles he has? Rommel, his temper flaring, shot back. "The best thing would be for you to come to Africa yourself and show us how to fight Montgomery with a rifle." Hitler ordered him out of the room. But here's what's crucial to understand. This confrontation, angry as it was, wasn't the breaking point. Hitler's aide actually chased Rommel down and brought him back for a more conciliatory conversation. Both men apologized in their own ways. Rommel left still believing that Hitler simply didn't understand the reality of the situation, that if he could just make the Führer see the truth, things would change. He still believed Hitler wanted what was best for Germany. That belief was about to be destroyed. In May of 1943, the Afrika Korps surrendered. 250,000 German and Italian soldiers were captured. It was a catastrophe on the scale of Stalingrad. Rommel, who had been evacuated before the final collapse, felt the loss personally. These were his men, soldiers he had led, fought beside, and they had been sacrificed for nothing. But something else was happening that would prove even more significant. Rommel was starting to hear rumors. Stories were filtering back from the Eastern Front, carried by officers who had served there, whispered in private conversations between trusted friends. Stories about mass executions, about systematic murder of civilians, about concentration camps and death camps, about something called the final solution. At first, Rommel refused to believe it. These were enemy propaganda tales, the kind of lies that had been told in every war. But the stories kept coming, and they came from German officers, men Rommel knew and trusted. Wehrmacht commanders were describing scenes they had witnessed, atrocities committed not just by the SS, but by regular army units. In late 1943, Rommel met with officers who had served under Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel on the Eastern Front. They told him things that made him physically ill. Villages burned with their inhabitants still inside. Jews rounded up and shot in massive pits. Prisoners of war systematically starved. The stories were consistent, detailed, and came from too many sources to be fabrications. Rommel had a choice at this point. He could dismiss these stories, convince himself they were exaggerations or isolated incidents. Many German officers made that choice. They told themselves they were serving Germany, that what happened in Russia was someone else's responsibility, that their duty was to their men and their mission. Rommel couldn't do it. The truth, once he allowed himself to see it, was impossible to ignore. The regime he served, the Führer he had admired, was committing crimes that no military victory could justify. This was the real turning point, the moment when Rommel's relationship with Hitler transformed from strained to hostile. In November of 1943, Rommel was given a new command. He was to inspect and improve the Atlantic Wall, the coastal fortifications stretching from Norway to Spain that were supposed to stop any Allied invasion of Western Europe. It was a crucial assignment, and it came with an uncomfortable truth. The Atlantic Wall that Hitler boasted about, the impregnable fortress he described in his speeches, didn't exist. Oh, there were fortifications, bunkers, and gun emplacements scattered along thousands of miles of coastline. But they were incomplete, poorly positioned, and nowhere near adequate to stop a determined invasion. Rommel threw himself into the work with characteristic energy. He traveled constantly, inspecting every sector, ordering new construction, repositioning artillery, laying millions of mines. He worked as if Germany's survival depended on it, because he believed it did. But here's what many people miss about this period. Rommel wasn't working to save Hitler's Germany anymore. He was working to save Germany itself. There's a crucial distinction there. By late 1943, Rommel had concluded that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. The question wasn't whether Germany would lose the war. The question was how much of Germany would be left when the war finally ended. Rommel had seen what happened in Russia. He knew the Soviets were pushing west, and he knew what Soviet occupation would mean for German civilians. He believed, perhaps naively, that if Germany could hold off the Western Allies long enough, if they could make an invasion of France too costly, there might be a chance for some kind of negotiated peace with Britain and America. That peace would require one thing. Hitler had to go. This is where we need to talk about the July 20th plot, because Rommel's relationship to it reveals everything about his character and his dilemma. In 1944, a group of German officers was planning to assassinate Hitler. The conspiracy included high-ranking Wehrmacht officers, politicians, and members of the German resistance. Their plan was simple: kill Hitler with a bomb, seize control of the government, and immediately seek peace with the Allies. Several of the conspirators approached Rommel. They wanted his support, his prestige, his leadership. Rommel listened to them, and here's what he said. No. Rommel opposed the assassination plot, but not because he wanted Hitler to survive. He opposed it because he believed assassination was morally wrong and legally indefensible. Rommel's entire worldview was built on concepts like duty, honor, and the rule of law. Murdering your head of state, even one as monstrous as Hitler had become, was anathema to everything Rommel believed about how civilized nations should conduct themselves. He proposed an alternative. Arrest Hitler. Put him on trial before the German people. Let Germany itself judge what its Führer had done. Then negotiate peace with the Western Allies. The conspirators argued with him. They told him Hitler would never allow himself to be arrested. They insisted assassination was the only practical solution. Rommel wouldn't budge. He would support a coup, yes. He would help arrest Hitler and establish a new government. But he would not be part of a murder plot. It's worth pausing here to understand how remarkable this position was. Rommel knew by this point what Hitler was. He knew about the Holocaust, about the death camps, about the millions murdered in the regime's name. He knew Hitler was leading Germany to absolute ruin. And yet, even knowing all of that, Rommel's moral code wouldn't let him support political assassination. You might call it naive. You might call it excessively principled. But it was utterly consistent with who Rommel was. On June 6, 1944, the Allies invaded Normandy. Rommel wasn't there. He had gone back to Germany to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday and to make another attempt to convince Hitler to face reality. When the call came through that morning telling him the invasion had begun, Rommel's first words were reportedly, "I knew it." He rushed back to France. But by the time he arrived, the critical first day was over. The Allies had established their beachhead. Everything Rommel had predicted had come true. The Atlantic Wall, impressive as it looked, hadn't been enough. Allied air superiority had prevented German reinforcements from reaching the beaches in time. The deception plan that convinced the Germans the real invasion would come at Calais had worked perfectly. Germany's 15th Army sat at Calais waiting for an invasion that never came, while the real invasion succeeded at Normandy. Rommel fought brilliantly in Normandy. He made the Allies pay for every mile with tactics that maximized his limited resources. But he knew it was hopeless. On June 15th, he met with Hitler to discuss the situation. Rommel told him bluntly that the war in the West was lost. Germany needed to seek peace immediately before the entire nation was destroyed. Hitler's response was chilling. "I see it well, but with me, no one will make peace." Think about that statement for a moment. Hitler knew Germany was defeated. He admitted it, directly, to Rommel's face. But he also made clear that he would rather see Germany destroyed than surrender. The war was no longer about Germany's survival. It was about Hitler's ego, Hitler's refusal to admit defeat, Hitler's willingness to sacrifice every German life, rather than face the consequences of what he had done. On July 15, 1944, Rommel wrote a 3-page letter to Hitler. It's one of the most important documents of the Second World War, though it doesn't get nearly the attention it deserves. In careful, formal military language, Rommel laid out the reality of Germany's situation. The Normandy front was collapsing. Allied material superiority was overwhelming. German forces were taking casualties they couldn't replace, while Allied reinforcements arrived constantly. The Luftwaffe was gone from the skies. The supply situation was catastrophic. Then, in language that was remarkable for its directness, Rommel told Hitler what needed to happen. The war must be ended. Germany must seek terms. And if the Allies wouldn't negotiate with Hitler as Führer, then Hitler must step aside for the good of the nation. Rommel sent this letter on July 15th. On July 17th, his staff car was strafed by British fighter planes near Sainte-Foy-de-Montgomery. Rommel was thrown from the vehicle, suffering a fractured skull, a broken cheekbone, and serious facial injuries. He was taken to a hospital barely alive. His military career was over. He would never command troops in battle again. On July 20th, 3 days after Rommel's injury, the assassination plot against Hitler was carried out. A bomb exploded at Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler survived, barely injured. The conspirators were rounded up, tortured, and executed. The Gestapo investigation expanded rapidly, pulling in thousands of people, many of whom had no connection to the plot. The investigators were looking for names, any names, of people who might have been sympathetic to the conspiracy. Rommel's name came up. Several of the conspirators, under torture, admitted they had talked to Rommel about the possibility of a coup. They made clear Rommel had refused to support assassination, but they also made clear he had expressed support for removing Hitler from power. That was enough. Hitler was furious. His favorite general, the man he had promoted and praised, had turned against him. But there was a problem. Rommel was a national hero. The German people knew his name, respected his accomplishments, and believed the propaganda that had turned him into a symbol of German military excellence. A public trial would be disastrous. It would give Rommel a platform to speak, to tell the German people what he thought of Hitler and the war. It would destroy the myth of unity, of loyalty, of German forces standing together under the Führer's leadership. Hitler made a decision. Rommel would be offered a choice: suicide or trial before the People's Court, followed by the arrest and probable execution of his wife and son. If Rommel chose suicide, his death would be attributed to his injuries from the plane attack. He would be given a state funeral. His family would be protected. His reputation would remain intact. Refuse, and everyone he loved would suffer. On October 14, 1944, 2 SS generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. Rommel met with them privately for about 20 minutes. Then he came out and told his wife and son what was happening. He explained the choice he had been given. He told them this was the price he had to pay for telling Hitler the truth. He asked his son to be strong, to take care of his mother. Then he got in the car with the 2 SS generals and drove away. The car stopped less than a mile from the house. The 2 generals got out and walked away, giving Rommel privacy for his final moments. He swallowed the cyanide they had provided. When they came back minutes later, he was already dying. They drove him to a hospital in Ulm, where he was officially pronounced dead from his injuries sustained in July. Hitler sent a state funeral wreath. Goebbels' propaganda machine praised Rommel's service and sacrifice. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, following a script written by the propaganda ministry, declared that Rommel's heart had belonged to the Führer. Every word was a performance, a lie told to maintain the fiction of unity. So why did Rommel do it? Why did he choose suicide over fighting back, over making a public stand? The answer tells us everything about who Rommel was. He chose suicide because it protected his family. His wife Lucy, his son Manfred, they would live. If he had refused, if he had demanded a trial, Hitler would have destroyed them out of spite. Rommel had seen enough of Nazi justice to know exactly what would happen. His family would be arrested, probably sent to camps, quite possibly killed. His suicide purchased their safety. It was his final act as a husband and father. But there's something else worth considering. Rommel also knew that a public trial would change nothing. Germany was already losing the war. Hitler was already leading the nation to ruin. One general speaking truth at a show trial wouldn't stop that. It might satisfy Rommel's sense of honor, his desire to have his final say, but it wouldn't save a single German life. His suicide, paradoxically, served a purpose. It preserved his reputation, which meant it preserved the respect German soldiers had for him, which might mean that when the war ended, his voice, his memory, his example might mean something in whatever Germany emerged from the ashes. 5 months after Rommel's death, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his Berlin bunker as Soviet forces closed in. Germany surrendered unconditionally days later. The nation was divided between East and West, occupied by the victorious Allies, its cities in ruins, its people facing a reckoning with the crimes committed in their name. Millions of Germans had died in the final months of the war, sacrificed for nothing as Hitler refused to surrender. Rommel had been right about everything. The war was lost. Continuing to fight served no purpose but Hitler's ego. Seeking peace earlier would have saved countless lives. But Rommel was dead, and his warnings had been ignored. The question it leaves behind is worth asking now. What do we do when the institutions we serve, the leaders we follow, the causes we believe in turn out to be monstrous? Rommel's answer was complex and flawed. He stayed loyal too long. He served a regime that committed unspeakable crimes, and the fact that he grew to oppose Hitler doesn't erase his complicity in Hitler's wars. But he also showed something important. He showed that it's possible to change, to recognize when you've been wrong, to stand against evil even when it costs you everything. Rommel's betrayal of Hitler wasn't a betrayal at all. It was the first truly honorable thing he did in years. He chose Germany over the Führer, chose truth over loyalty, chose to speak out even knowing it would kill him. The real tragedy is that by the time he made that choice, it was already too late to matter.